as you know, we've been running a series of lectures on feminist theory texts, and we've already done about a dozen texts in that particular category, starting from the late 18th century up to the early 20th century. And today's lecture by Professor Payal Nagpal, who teaches English literature in Janki Devi College, Delhi University. She has worked extensively on theory, and she has lots of things to impart and share with you regarding that theory. And so far as Betty Friedan is concerned, she is an American feminist, and she belongs to the mid 20th century, and she has a great deal of influence on contemporary thought. So all these things are supposed to come out in the form of points that Professor Payal Nagpal will present to you regarding a selected part of her book, the Feminine Mystique, that she has mentioned on the screen. So I request now Dr. Payal Nagpal to kindly give her lecture.
Thank you, Professor Prakash. Today's lecture will be on, as Professor Prakash pointed out, on Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, and I will be referring to two specific chapters from this book. Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, was published in 1963, and it comes at a very crucial point, and it needs to be read against the backdrop of Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex. The latter was actually, of course, published in 1949, and the English in French, and the English translation appeared in 1953. So, when we look at Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, it's a book that comes precisely 10 years later. And what, in a sense, Simone de Beauvoir is writing in her book, is discussing in her book, the ideas that she is presenting about the social conditioning of girls as women. I think that is an idea that Friedan approaches from a very, very practical experience of having interviewed a lot of American women. And she raises a very, very crucial question. It's not as if she arrives straight away at the idea of the feminine mystique, but she first of all calls it the problem that has no name. And she talks about this great dissatisfaction among American women of the 1950s, who were very, very who felt very unhinged and unsettled, and despite their apparent happiness in the domestic sphere, something that was presented in magazines and in the world around them, the image of the happy housewife. This is something that she dispels by first of all beginning with what she calls the problem that has no name, and identifying it as what she calls the feminine mystique, the idea of femininity that Friedan presents. And this is based on a lot of real life data, interviews that Friedan conducted with a lot of American women, and that forms the basis of her argument in this book. So in a sense, the book The Feminine Mystique does the following. It begins by first of all identifying that there is a problem that might not have a name, but a problem that nonetheless was there, about how women in America were unaware, in a sense, of their own experiences. And so she calls it a problem that has no name. This is based on her perception of what women were undergoing. The book then presents extensive data about women's experiences in the domestic sphere and how they were conditioned into just looking, as in appearing physically, feminine, and of course getting married. So this she calls the feminine mystique, where the bulk of the book presents this, her theoretical argument based on interviews of women, mostly women who were housewives, and how they felt, in a sense, that they were lost somewhere. In the last chapter, which is titled A New Life Plan for Women, Friedan explores the possible solutions. So the first part of the lecture today will present her theoretical premise based on this data that she collected, and the second will look at Frieden's understanding of the possible solutions. If you look at just the very first few lines of the chapter titled "The Problem That Has No Name," the problem lay buried, unspoken for many years in the minds of American women. It was a strange stirring, a sense of dissatisfaction, a yearning that women suffered in the middle of the 20th century in the United States. So she presents this as something, as a feeling, as a sentiment that is buried, that has not been talked about for many years. And why this is crucial is because we've already discussed in the course of lectures in this series, we've extensively discussed the suffragette movement. But when we look at how women won the right to vote in different countries, suddenly, especially in the context of America, as Frieden points out, there is a complete lull. And women are just, now restricted to their home sphere, their domestic sphere, their hearth, as wives, as mothers, and the women who had actually fought on the streets, and when the men went to fight the wars, the women took up jobs, and they were working women, they were women who were productive. And suddenly there is this phase post the Second World War where there is nothing really speaking that is happening. So she goes on, as she made the beds, this is again based on her interactions with these women, as she made the beds, shopped for groceries, matched slip cover material, ate peanut butter sandwiches with her children, chauffeured Cub Scouts and brownies, lay beside her husband at night, she was afraid to ask even of herself the silent question, is this all? So the question that she is asking is that, is her life only going to be about taking care of the house, shopping for groceries, making sure that everything in her home looks perfect, taking the children for Cub Scouts and brownies, being the good wife in every possible manner? So is this all? And so this is one of the questions that she's posing. And I'd request Professor Prakash here to share his views on this aspect of women, especially in the post-Second World War scenario, about how they were suddenly expected to conform to notions of femininity.
No, I am particularly struck by the usage, the happy housewife. And I straight away thought, as you are saying about this word, that perhaps in India, the true translation of happy house would be Suhagin. So Suhagin means a woman who is well settled in the home. But then it's a woman who is settled in the home, and she has to follow the discipline of the home, the requirements of marriage, the requirements of nurturing children, and that's what defines her life. So this would be a scathing attack on the way in which the males in a society treat their women, assign them roles, and don't allow them to come out of it. So I think, and it's slightly surprising that we are talking about America, the country which is supposed to be carry forward the flame of progressive thought and modernity. If modernity means that the woman has to stay back at home and wait for her husband to come back in the evening, or to go to a war much beyond the frontiers of America, and then coming back after a year, after 2 years, and then this man is to be welcomed, and in the meantime she has held the fort. So that kind of situation in America should actually compel us to think about the state of women in the rest of the world. So I would definitely feel concerned about the women of America who have the impression of who give the impression of being very comfortable in their homes, but I think they are totally, entirely put behind the curtain, and the curtain is a happily married woman.
Yes, in fact, so much so that Frieden calls it the myth of the happy housewife, and by dispelling, by first of all identifying that there is an issue, and calling it the feminine mystique, she dispels this notion. And in fact, she calls it, she says there's only one occupation that the women are trained in, and she says it's called occupation housewife.
And the phrase, without a name.
Yes.
So if there's no name, and the language has totally shut the door to the presence and definition of a woman, and then it becomes a mystique. It is something that you don't understand, and you are not allowed, in fact, to make sense of whatever is happening around you.
In fact, it also draws attention to the whole notion that when we talk about the problems that women were facing then, the idea is that this was not considered to be a problem. So, you know, they would be sent to therapists and psychiatrists and so on, that there was something wrong with them, that they were undergoing depression or anxiety. But all this was actually related to the fact that they experienced this huge lack in their lives. The question that, is this all? Is their life going to be a series of endless chores?
And secondly, as you have said, that the book was written in the 1960s, and after that things have not changed much.
Yes.
Even today, I would believe that most of the feminists and other women would agree with this person for critiquing the place of women in society.
Yes, absolutely. That's completely true.
Which means that it has not compelled men to rethink their position vis-a-vis women.
Yeah. So in the book, she then presents data of how by the end of the 1950s, the average marriage of women in America dropped to about 20, the marriageable age, that is, and was further dropping into the teens. And the number of women going to college, and going in for higher education, even that dropped. So she presents solid statistical data regarding this. When we read this today in the 21st century, we try and understand the feminist movement and what was happening in the 60s. And I would like to reiterate that this needs to be read. These two books actually go very well together than, Second Sex, which of course came 10 years earlier. So this meant that there was a vital change in the way in which women's role was being perceived by society. The question that we need to ask then at this point is that in the course of history, the society has viewed women from the lens of convenience, in a sense, because it was convenient for the society to let them hold fort and to let the women go out and work. But once the men were back, they were again expected to conform and play the conventional role. So when desired, they were expected to be productive workers, to work hard, to take up jobs. And as the men returned, they were expected to be back within what is called the hearth. So the women's fight, in a sense, for the vote was over, their struggle was over, but what were they doing? And this was the question that women were increasingly asking themselves. What was their life, in a sense, going to turn into? So what was emerging and the women were conforming to unthinkingly was the mold of femininity. What, really speaking, is femininity? How do we look at it? And again, I'll quote from the Feminine Mystique. Friedan says that words like emancipation and career sounded strange and embarrassing. No one had used them for years. When a French woman, and here's a direct reference to Simone de Beauvoir, so when a French woman called Simone de Beauvoir wrote a book called The Second Sex, an American critic commented that she obviously didn't know what life was all about, and besides, she was talking about French women. The woman problem in America no longer existed. So it's fascinating to see how Friedan actually totally, this is a very, very seminal book for this reason, she totally explodes the myth of femininity and the myth of the happy housewife, of the happy woman in American society, at the end of 1950s and in the 1960s. So fulfillment in this sense, for a woman in America in the 50s and 60s was then related to taking care of the husband, children, family at large, and performing, of course, an endless series of household chores. This also meant that women were expected to perform all the time. And the performance of a woman was always without fail as that of a housewife. And Friedan, that is why she calls it, there is only one occupation that they are trained in, and that is occupation housewife. And this is what defined the women in this period. So I
would also use the word performance, which means the person is not living, the person is not experiencing, the person is not realizing oneself. She is only performing a role, and the role has been given to her by others.
Yes.
And it's a well-defined role, it's a social role that she is to perform. but social role of the kind that will only give comfort and convenience to the males. So that is what performance means.
True.
So where is the person in the entire scheme of things?
So, which is why during this time she also kind of, apart from the fact that she interviews the women and she looks at a lot of magazines that women were reading at the time, she also kind of, speaks to them about their physical and mental well-being, and how so many of them would actually go to therapists and so on because they felt they were experiencing anxiety and depression. But when she would speak to them a little more, they would then speak up and talk about how, they felt that their life, now really speaking, had no meaning.
And particularly in the context of society, a woman is supposed to behave as a woman, which you call femininity.
Yes.
That she has to appear in a certain manner. She has to be always giving some kind of peace and tranquility to the house. She must be attractive. She must be properly dressed. She must be able to welcome, the guests to the family and all those things. And she has to create that atmosphere of happiness all around her. So if this is what a woman is supposed to do, then she is only performing a role, as you pointed out in the beginning.
In fact, this lack of an identity, lack of an existence in the real sense. But the women at that point, as Frieden explains, did not have the courage to either understand it or to voice it, because the model of the perfect housewife was an overarching model. It was imposing. It was something that they had to conform to. So, and I will just share one of the, this is from an interview with one of the women, a mother of 4, who left college at 19 to get married. And I quote her, "I've tried everything women are supposed to do," she says. "Hobbies, gardening, pickling, canning, being very social with my neighbors, joining committees, running PTAs, as in parent-teacher associations. All I wanted was to get married and have 4 children. I love my kids and Bob and my home," she says. "There's no problem. There's no problem you can even put a name to. But I'm desperate. I begin to feel I have no personality. But who am I?" And this is scores of women that Frieden interviewed, and there are numerous quotations from these interviews. So, and she explains that, this was the mold. I mean, the desirable mold was, in fact, she even mentions how a woman had got through a higher education institution and got into a very good course. But she dropped all that. And why? Because she just wanted to conform to the model that was there. And Frieden points out how a lot of literature that was being provided, that these women were reading, did not have the model of a career woman. In fact, the word career was considered to be, absolutely antithetical to the mold of femininity. So, and she says that, she's conformed to that mold, the mold of femininity, and she's done everything. So, how women, in a sense, this is her statement is a reflection of what women are expected to do. So, you could, and Frieden also kind of theorizes on this, that, you could be painting and you could be doing a lot of things as hobbies, but this is not productive work. And then gardening and pickling and canning and, maintaining social ties and being good to the neighbors and always attending school meetings and so on. She says that this is what she had, and it's not as if she loved her family any less for it, but she says, what about the woman there? That's the question that she asks, and she says that she's desperate. She says, but I'm desperate. I begin to feel I have no personality, but who am I? And this was the question that many women in America were kind of asking themselves and could not locate any answers, could not find the real source of the problem, because it was difficult, because it required a complete reorientation in the way women were expected to think and behave. So Frieden says that, this problem then, almost she says it burst like a boil. The image of the perfectly happy American housewife was busted. And the educated housewife also became schizophrenic because, and she says, it's a beautiful line from the book. She says, once she wrote a paper on the graveyard poets, and now she writes notes to the milkman. And this is not only a reflection on the complete, on the drastic drop in the way women's lives were to be oriented and how they are going to be, practically confined. So she explains how women felt that the problem was different from other problems like hunger and poverty. So the reason this problem does not have a name is because if somebody is hungry, there's a real-time problem. Somebody is poor, there's a real-time problem. But what do women do with a problem like this that they were experiencing? So this also meant that people from the medical world, people from the social world, they all had to change their approach towards the study of women, and women could no longer be looked at in the same manner. So in fact, Friedan says that this loss of femininity, she says it's not a loss, it's an age-old problem that a woman felt. So she says that this desire that she wanted something more than her husband, her children and her home is a real-time problem. So
there is also the question of America in the 1950s and 60s becoming an industrialized society, very developed.
Yes.
You have all the facilities and you can really call the shots in terms of comforts. But then post-industrial or industrial society does not give any particular significance to the woman, and therefore the description that you have given of it, as per the opinion of the author, is that it's an existentialist problem that the woman is facing. She's asking these questions: who am I? What am I supposed to do? And am I supposed to suffer? Do I only live for others? So all these questions, bring out a state of mind, and I believe that existentialism of the wrong kind has already taken root in the American women's life.
Yes, and this is however, this is what Betty Friedan tries to unpack. Mm-hmm. And she says that it's not an existential problem, mm-hmm. it's a social problem. Mm-hmm. And it's a problem that's not just restricted to the 50s and 60s, which is why she says it's an age-old problem. Mm-hmm. Because from the very beginning, there has been this notion of femininity that women have been expected to conform to. But these women are different in the sense that they have also experienced, some of them have also experienced the joy of working, of stepping out. But now, in a so-called developed world, there is no role mm-hmm. as productive workers for these women, mm-hmm. and that is what she's gradually going to steer it towards that, lifting it out of being just an existential dilemma to look at it also as a social problem. In fact, Friedan says that the political landscape of the world has totally changed. I mean, she talks about Castro, she talks about formation of new nations in the African continent and changes in astronomy and so on in the field of science. Everywhere there is a lot of development, but it seems as if the women have been kept away from all this.
Can you explain also the idea of the career woman? Well, you use this word, so yes. What exactly does it signify?
Yes, in fact, when we look at a new life plan, mm-hmm. she says she deliberately uses the word life plan, and she says that she's using it because the word career is considered to be something where the women are going to be practically, they're going to be looked at as selfish beings in some way. So she looks at it, she rephrases it and presents the idea of career for women as a new life plan. And she examines, in fact she says, when she talks about this lack of the model of the career woman, she examines the role of women's magazines. Mm-hmm. And the kind of magazine, she looks at about 3 or 4 very prominent magazines and talks about them and says that in these magazines, there is not a single woman who continues with her career. If at all, there is 1 out of 3, in a sense have a career, but they give it all up for marriage. So there is no role model, in the books that these women are reading where they're going to be able to look at it as their career choice. It's not available.
This means that women get education and then they attract the attention of some male whom they would marry, and after that, that education would come to naught.
Yes.
Because she can't pursue a career.
Yes, in fact, there's a lot of films actually on this particular topic also, where going into a higher education institution was primarily seen as also becoming an accomplished woman so that you could get a good suitor. So And she then defines the feminine mystique, and Frieden says that the highest value and the only commitment for women is the fulfillment of their own femininity. And it says that the great mistake of Western culture through most of its history has been the undervaluation of this femininity. So she defines what this mystique is. It is this, commitment to this model of becoming feminine is what the feminine mystique is all about.
So friends, in this discussion, Professor Payal Nagpal has stressed the need for a kind of socially productive career for women in America, and that is not happening, and because of which the middle of the 20th century woman in America was actually confined to the discipline of what can be called femininity. We'll discuss it further in the following lecture, but so far as here we are concerned, then we say that the American woman is stressed very hard by the concept of becoming attractive, becoming useful, but not being herself. Thank you.